Howdy, y'all. You're listening to The Fixed Star. I'm Jacob David Glenn. Today I'm going to be joined by Sam Bass and David L. Hudson Jr. Today we're looking at the George Orwell essay, The Prevention of Literature. He wrote this in 1946, looking at the role literature played in the past in the rise of totalitarian and far leftist movements. He looks at the freedom to write what you want, the freedom to think what you want, and what role that's going to play in society, what role it had played at that time. And in this conversation, we look at what he had to say as well as consider what it means for us today, what insights it might provide us today. We are excited for you to join us. If you enjoy what you hear, please leave a review or subscribe and check out forthcoming work on thefixedstar.com.
Welcome to The Fixed Star. In this episode, we're going to examine one of George Orwell's famous essays, The Prevention of Literature. It's an essay that he wrote in 1944 on the 300th year anniversary of Areopagitica. And if anyone's unfamiliar with Areopagitica, we highly recommend that you read it. It was an essay that was authored by the great John Milton 1 year after the English licensing law in 1643. It's considered to be one of the foundational documents, one of the progenitors, if you will, of modern First Amendment jurisprudence. And one thing that Milton wrote in there is probably the most famous passage of Areopagitica. It's something that Jacob and I have talked about as one of the famous phrases in all of intellectual liberty. It's, quote, "And though all the winds of doctrine were let loose to play upon the earth, so truth be in the field. We do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength. Let her and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter." And it's really Milton's Areopagitica and John Stuart Mill's On Liberty that ultimately led to Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes's great dissent in Abrams versus United States in 1919, which is really where we got the starting point for modern First Amendment jurisprudence and the idea that we should have a free and open marketplace of ideas.
So that to build off that, or just comments on that Areopagitica is quoted in most constitutional law textbooks, or especially in the First Amendment area. And then also I saw multiple textbooks. It was also in the introduction to a mass media law textbook. So it's definitely foundational, certainly, and makes an appearance throughout any discussion. And naturally, it makes an appearance here. It's mentioned at the start of this essay that Orwell writes that we're reading, and he's thinking about this, and he's thinking about a conversation he was involved in, and he notes that other folks were. He kind of observes that people were failing to grasp the essence of free thought, in a sense, and free society, the significance. So he writes in the beginning of the essay, he says, out of this concourse of several hundred people where this conversation was happening, perhaps half of whom were directly connected with the writing trade, there was not a single one who could point out that freedom of the press, if it means anything at all, means the freedom to criticize and oppose. Now that's a sentiment that has arisen in basically every First Amendment case that's come before the court. That idea is engaged in to some extent, or discussed, or at least nominally mentioned. And so it's interesting that Orwell's noticing this, and he's writing at the end of World War II. He's writing in 1946, and he observed at that time that there were two factions in opposition with around the globe, and in that time, so the early to mid 20th century, the totalitarian, the kind of nationalist movements, and then the more left-leaning Marxist kind of intelligentsia movements that are battling for power. And one thing that I think he taps into, though not exactly explicitly, but that we've mentioned before on an earlier essay or an earlier episode, and something Sam and I've talked a ton about, but uh, Peter Rollins, who's a theologian philosopher who talks about this a lot, and also Rene Girard in his mimetic theory, notes that when you start to define yourself or by as an opposition to your enemy, you start to look like that perceived enemy, and those things kind of push each other outward towards to where that middle ground gets smaller and smaller. And I'm sort of treating these quite quickly, but they start to mirror each other, and it's only natural that suppression becomes the consequence of battling your enemy's perceived suppression in some sense.
Most recently and colloquially referenced in The Batman, where I think it was Harvey Dent says you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. It's like that sort of idea.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah. So in the essay, he he says he's going to grapple with the idea of whether free speech is desirable. He says he's grappling with the dangerous proposition that freedom is undesirable and that intellectual honesty is a form of antisocial selfishness. And there's sort of three movements, you might say, topics, categories that we put this piece in which we're going to deal with it. And the first is this idea that those who gain power tend to take upon themselves the decision of what will or will not be truth. Those who are able will say, okay, we're going to disregard leaving truth freely flowing, as in the Areopagitica quote that you quite impressively just busted out there. But instead, we're going to start to control. And so Hudson and I are working on an article about free speech, naturally, and we're working on it in the context of professionalism pledges and where certain people are being put out of certain programs because they have ideas that differ with those who are in authority in those different disciplines and those different programs. And at the time when we were really working on the core of this, I also happened to be reading a Thomas Sowell book, Basic Economics, one of his most well-known books. And in there, he talks about how in the USSR there were economists who were put in charge of setting prices in certain areas. So instead of allowing prices to be created, I'm not an economist, but instead of allowing prices to be generated by supply and demand organically, they presumed to take the power of saying what a thing costs into their own hands. So I think this is a great analogy for the marketplace of ideas. The marketplace itself has something to show us about the marketplace of ideas. When these economists presumed to take control of setting prices without regard to what the forces of supply and demand might say, there's an example where these Soviet economists noted one time they raised the prices of moleskins. So what that did is it caused a bunch of people to go out and get these skins, but they had an excess of supply in compared to their demand, but the prices are elevated, so the incentive is there to go out and get these skins. So what happens is they just have warehouses full of these skins because the incentive to go and get them is artificially inflated. And when you take control, but when you take control, it's hard to keep apprised of how that's going to function in the greater context of the economy. So I think these economists noted that it's not that they couldn't handle setting the prices for moleskins, but it's that they couldn't handle setting the price for moleskins at the same time as they're setting prices for millions of other things. It's just too much to keep track of. So if we look at that analogy in the context of ideas, then we see there's literally an infinite possibility of ideas out there, infinite amount of ideas. So to presume to say what truth is and is not, to incentivize writing, for example, in the context of the freedom of the press on this one issue, leaves the whole infinite other possibility of subjects under incentivized to be presented.
And that's, the fact we're talking about the marketplace of ideas, which probably remains the most pervasive metaphor in First Amendment law. But a lot of the modern debate about freedom of speech, in 21st century America is the marketplace of ideas really the model that we should be using? In other words, there are market failures, there's differential access to the marketplace. And that's one of the points that, for example, critical race theorists posit, is they say that the marketplace of ideas is fundamentally imbalanced, and there needs to be a fundamental shift and greater consideration given to 14th Amendment equality interest as opposed to, say, First Amendment liberty interest. But it's fascinating that, when the marketplace of ideas metaphor was used by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, we're dealing in a time period when Holmes is also writing about, at a time period when the dominant economic theory is sort of laissez-faire, right? That we don't want the government interfering, so just let it play out. And what a lot of people say in modern society, well, if you let it play out, then certain groups are always going to dominate other groups.
I think it's important to note on that point that the marketplace of ideas does not necessarily mean that the best idea, I mean, that's the theoretical truth, right? That the best ideas will rise to the top. But that's only in a society that pursues truth above all. So if you look at it, like, what's the best hamburger in America? If you just judge by the marketplace, that would be it'd have to be like the Big Mac or something, right? It's the thing that's bought the
No, it's
most.
the quarter pounder with cheese. Come on.
Right. Well, whichever, right? It's one of those. But I think there's a lot of artisan burger makers in town who are making something that, if we just go by, if we look at success, we say, okay, well, that can't compete with the Big Mac or the quarter pounder with cheese because
Fat Moe's, man. You got to go with Fat Moe's.
right. Okay. So that's exactly the point. So Fat Moe's in Nashville, awesome burgers. But in the context of the marketplace of ideas, it holds a much smaller faction. So it's only when we go in. So I guess what I'm saying is there's an impetus on the population to value ideas, to consume ideas for their merit and not for their convenience or for other adultering reasons.
Well, and the
Yeah.
other part is, right, a lot of it's rhetorical appeal, right? You have somebody with very noxious ideas, but has mastered the power of persuasion. We've seen throughout history that sometimes some very awful people have been able to put forth some incredibly repugnant and noxious ideas because of rhetorical skills and the power of persuasion.
Yeah, I think in a Nietzschean sense of like, how does a slave who could never physically overcome the master in nature, how does he overcome? And it's like, well, it's through like convincing the master that his actions are morally abhorrent and he should stop them, because like that's the only way you win. And I think it just it's so frustrating and infuriating to, because it's only people who can't get their way and who desire power who would ever oppose something like freedom of thought or freedom of speech. Like, I mean, I think another example of the idea of outside of the hamburger example, like technology has made it so accessible to get your ideas across. Like we think about blockchain, and it's just like, okay, we have like one guy with one idea that is now making the rest of the financial world that was previously very set. Who would have thought that the financial system would be rethought? But there's one person with an idea, and now everything's being undone and redone in light of that. And so it's like, a good idea still can take hold like wildfire if it's right.
What you just said about master slave?
Mm-hmm.
I find it fascinating. There were three major slave rebellions. Leaders of those three slave rebellions, I think, were Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner. And what was one of the governmental responses to slave rebellions was passing laws that prohibited slaves from reading or from teaching slaves to read. And that speaks, I think, mightily to your point about, governmental attempts to discourage and stamp out and prohibit freedom of thought or anathema, to a free society and to fundamental fairness.
Well, and so speaking of the stamping out, there's one other thing that Orwell wrote in here. He wrote, "The friends of totalitarianism usually tend to," and I'm skipping some words to make it fit, but the friends of totalitarianism usually tend to argue that since absolute truth is not attainable, a big lie is no worse than a little lie. So with regard to the previous statement, the previous quote I read a moment ago, it's as if once you've begun the process of taking the marketplace of ideas into your own hands, you can't stop, because once the thing is predicated on a lie, you have to introduce more and more little lies to substantiate the big lie that justifies everything. So to look at that in the modern context of the 14th Amendment superseding the First Amendment, as you just talked about, or as some would like for that to happen, the equal protection principles, they're of such paramount importance that they have to come and stamp out more and more that might arise as a potential threat to the narrative that's moving forward. So I think we've talked about that. The next theme that appears in Orwell's paper is that he seems to suggest, or seems to be arguing, that people really can't exist in a society without the ability to think. Like it's not reasonable. It's not so he puts forth a couple arguments that he says this is what people have said to him when he says we need to have freedom of thought. So he says, whenever one attempts to defend intellectual liberty against the claims of totalitarianism, one meets with these arguments in one form or another. They're based on a complete misunderstanding of what literature is and how, one should perhaps say, it comes into being. And so these arguments are, one might say, even under the tightest dictatorship, can an individual writer remain free inside his own mind and distill or disguise his unorthodox ideas in such a way that the authorities will be too stupid to recognize them? Well, in a society that is presuming to prize free thought, that's quite a burden of surgical, subversive technique to place upon an artist.
And that you mentioned about injecting with some First Amendment cases, it brings to mind one of, I think, the finest defenders of freedom of expression that's ever sat on the United States Supreme Court. And he doesn't get a lot of respect this way because he's most often noted for his incredible civil rights advocacy, but that's none other than Justice Thurgood Marshall. But in Stanley versus Georgia in 1969, he wrote, quote, our whole constitutional heritage rebels at the thought of giving government the power to control men's minds. And to me, that's probably the U.S. Supreme Court's most eloquent articulation of the importance of freedom of thought to freedom of speech. Because if you don't have freedom of thought, then you're not going to have freedom of speech or freedom of the press.
I like what the whole thing's talking about like licensure and literature and things like that. And so it just made me think about art in general and the importance that art plays in critiquing society. And so that's why I find it just deeply ironic whenever you have actors and musicians and people who are in favor of more government controlling type systems like communism or socialism or whatever. It's like I can't think of a group of people who are often more immediately put down and silenced after the overthrow than artists. Like these are the first people who are going to be controlled and told exactly what to do and exactly what to say and like what the state can and can't put on. And so it's like, these people above all should be fighting for freedom of thought and expression. And I think now currently we're seeing it amongst comedians, because I think they're the first ones that are really being hindered. And they're like, hold on a second, like, this is my job. My job is presenting a mirror to you so you can see how ridiculous this is. And if I can't do this, then like we have a big problem.
And it's history repeating itself. Look what the government tried to do to Lenny Bruce back in the 1960s, right? He was one of the leading comedians, and he was prosecuted for his speech and his routines. You know, we have to have freedom of thought for those who push the boundaries, who push the edges, right? Or otherwise, there's no freedom at all. One of my favorite quotes is actually Ruxel Luxemburg: that freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently.
Exactly. Well, and when we were getting earlier into John Milton, I was looking earlier of where the name Areopagitica comes from, and it was even referenced earlier from like a Athenian orator Isocrates. He gave a speech in 4th century BC, and even that was referenced again when St. Paul was defending himself against Athens for, according to Wikipedia, promulgating foreign gods and strange teachings. So it's just like, this is not new to the West, defending free speech. And I don't know, but this is a whole other tangent, but I think it's precisely the West that has given rise to such things that would undermine itself. And then we're just coming back with the freedoms that were given to us with critiquing the very structure that presented the framework for us to operate in.
And so a couple other arguments that Orwell notes that he hears is that one being, in any case, if the writer himself is in agreement with the prevailing orthodoxy, why should it have a cramping effect on him? Well, Hudson, I think I'm going to try to tap into your encyclopedic recall here, but there's some case where it says it's not the majority speech that needs protection, but it's the minority that needs protection. Do you happen to recall what I'm getting at?
I mean, that actually comes from Justice Jackson's opinion, I believe, in West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett. I can't remember the exact phrase, but he certainly talks about that in there, that the Bill of Rights at its root is a counter-majoritarian document, right? It's the voices of he talks about it in Barnett. He talks about it's a mere shadow of freedom, right? The freedom to differ is what the most important freedom is, right?
And so, observing that the concern over that freedom to differ, I think Orwell hits it on the head here. He says he talks about the governments who are seeking to have a totalitarian type of control. They can't allow dissent at all, and they have to, like, the little lies are no less necessary than the big lies, because everything's facilitating larger lies. So, or the power they're trying to establish. He says even a single taboo can have an all-around crippling effect on the mind, because there's always the danger that any thought which is freely followed up may lead to the forbidden thought. And when I was reading that, I was thinking, wow, I wrote that almost 100, I guess almost 80 years ago. And that so accurately portrays the cancel culture of today. When if someone's thinking something that tends to suggest or threatens to lead to a conclusion that we don't want, that we know is outlawed, then even that subordinate possibility, that thought or that consideration has to be shut down as well. It's just really fascinating, the insight that he had at this time, how it's true, maybe even more magnified in its truth, and the ability to perceive its truth today. And so he's looking in the wake of World War II, in the wake of the Spanish Civil War in particular. He writes, wherever there is an enforced orthodoxy, or even two orthodoxies, as often happens, good writing stops. So writing that has use for society. This was well illustrated by the Spanish Civil War. To many English intellectuals, the war was a deeply moving experience, but not an experience about which they could write sincerely. There were only two things that you were allowed to say, and both of them were palpable lies. As a result, the war produced acres of print, but almost nothing worth reading. So that I found that line particularly moving in this essay. Acres of print, but almost nothing worth reading, because only two sides. There's kind of, I think what he's referring to is the things in support of the nationalist side and things in support of the Republicans, the more Marxist, anarchist-leaning sides, were the allowed opinions depending on which circles and which sides you were in support of. So moving on to the final sort of section that we gleaned from his work, he notes there's a question I think that's being asked of his time that definitely is being asked of our time. He is considering whether the despotisms that have predated him were real tyranny. He says literature has sometimes flourished. So one of the counter arguments to his argument against a totalitarian thought is that perhaps literature has thrived under these regimes. Perhaps great work rises in opposition. But he says, maybe we haven't actually had a true effective totalitarian government like he presents in 1984. So he says, literature has sometimes flourished under despotic regimes, but as often has been pointed out, the despotisms of the past were not totalitarian. There's to the point of that criticism that maybe the great literature it arises on testing and tribulation, which isn't a reason to suppress people, by the way, that it might produce a great book. But if one were to be so audacious as to consider that argument, Tertullian, one of the church fathers, said something that's really interesting that I think would support that point, not in the particular application, but conceptually. He said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, meaning Christianity, partially in the beginning, spread because it was a David to a Goliath. It was this story that was compelling. And you could even make that argument about Orwell's most popular works themselves. Animal Farm in 1984 are effective because they're Davids who have their Goliaths. They have their enemy that we can all get behind and say, yeah, that's right. But these were able to flourish because there are societies that allow them. And there weren't total totalitarian regimes that could shut them down. And I wonder today, I think it's inevitable. We get closer and closer and closer to the possibility of a society that could feasibly be an actual totalitarianist state, or totalitarian state, excuse me. With the ubiquity of technology, the way we consume and are given information, the way information is presented and suggested to us, and then the increasing, now this is decades old argument or town crier sort of shouting out, but the just increasing power that governments have. I wonder what y'all think about that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that struck me was he warned that one of the great threats to freedom of the press was also the concentration of ownership of the media, and that the whole phenomenon of media convergence and the fact that you have fewer and fewer oligarchs really that control the means of expression, and now we have the new governors, like the heads of these social media entities. And one of the great modern debates in at least in the free speech world is whether these social media giants like Facebook and Twitter, are they quasi-state actors? Should they be considered quasi-state actors and subject to First Amendment scrutiny when they engage in censorship of speech and selective targeting of specific viewpoints? And I do think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the structure of the modern technological world could lead to greater, more effective forms of censorship. And that's why freedom of thought has to be protected, celebrated, and applauded, is because we don't want to engage in groupthink, right? We want people to stand up and offer different points of view. It's the only way, I think, to have true progression, is to have dissent.
And I think if we allow it to go too far, we won't be able to have that 1984, that Brave New World written. Partially because I don't think, as a population writ large, we think as deeply as maybe we once did. Maybe that's just total nostalgia, or glorification of a past that never existed. I don't know. But it certainly seems possible to me that we could get to that place. And so I think that's actually the Brave New World perspective, where it differs from the 1984 perspective. And interestingly, Orwell wrote this passage I'd like to read here briefly that struck me as Huxleyan, and it might be a good place for us to kind of wrap up, because I think he is pointing in that direction. He takes a moment to talk about the future of literature. And he says, of course, print will continue to be used, and it is interesting to speculate what kinds of reading matter would survive in a rigidly totalitarian society. Newspapers will presumably continue until television technique reaches a higher level, but apart from newspapers, it is doubtful even now whether the great mass of people in the industrialized countries feel the need for any kind of literature. So here he is saying, at least what I think he's saying is that he's concerned about the lack of concern that could be in a society that doesn't read. So the literature that's he's concerned about is being suppressed. Maybe people aren't even going to care about it because they'll be distracted by other types of things. They won't be making the effort to read it. And again, that's sort of that nostalgic, maybe false view of the past. I don't know. Maybe even he's doing it in his time. It's hard to say. I mean, the world did just get swept up into a very extreme nationalist movement in continental Europe that affected the whole world. So who knows? Um, but it's an interesting thing for us to consider. I think it actually has it ties into our discussion of style versus substance. And I don't want to go down that whole road again, but if anyone's interested in checking that, I think those concerns, I wouldn't say are implicated here, but several points down the road become to be implicated in what ramifications that could have for society writ large. And with that, I think we'll wrap this episode up. We, I think, all very highly recommend this essay, The Prevention of Literature. A lot to think about. We sort of scratched the surface and did a shallow review, but there's definitely a lot of depth and a lot of thought. Really a brilliant piece. But anyhow, Sam Bass, David L. Hudson Jr., I'm Jacob David Glenn. This is The Fixed Star. Great to be with you again, and we'll see you next week.